Hello, I'm John, and I wanted to continue with my analysis of Wallace Stevens' poem Invective Against Swans. This is part two of my analysis. What have we already said about this poem? Well, we talked about the word invective as meaning a curse, an attempt to abuse or do harm via words, via rhetoric. Uh, in the classical context, it was a way of censoring someone for their behavior, uh, for example, for public drunkenness, for their um, foibles of one form or another, often being rooted in illicit love, sex for that matter. Now, in this, what was interesting is that the invective is not directed against a person, it's directed against swans, not one thing, but a class of things. Swans, of course, as we know, figure prominently in poetry and myth, and as such, they are referred to, they're alluded to in literature by typically by very literary types. We could imagine then that in this mode of attack, this verbal mode of attack called invective, swans could be weaponized like anything else. And so we might look at this as being an application of rhetoric against one of the forms of rhetoric. That's one possible way to wade into this because the question still is why does the speaker have it out, as it were, for swans? I said that he used perhaps ganders, he misidentified the swans to their faces, so to speak, because he wanted to insult them, saying, "You're not swans, you're actually just geese," which of course fits very nicely in invective. It's subtle in a way. Ganders, of course, has a gender attribute to it. Um, I think I said that swans have a feminine quality to them, if you will, if we want to think of things, uh, beautiful things as being feminine things. And we're distinguishing that feminine quality with a masculine uh, quality. But of course, once we start to bring gender and sex into it, we start to talk about, uh, we start to get into the whole realm of desire, which is another reason to target someone in classical invective for their illicit sexual behavior. I also talked about the soul, the indestructible, the pure essence of ourselves that survives death. The way that the soul is portrayed is as beyond. One might even think spatially beyond, as though it affords the speaker an almost God's eye view, a view unencumbered by um, everyday distractions or deviations from behavior. One can behave purely, one can be one's own soul if one rises above that fray, that fraught space of contest between humans, between desires fulfilled or other resentments. Now, I'd also like to say that when one uses an invective, one invariably creates a problem. It creates strife. It creates discord between people. Now, the soul is implicitly beyond these, call them temptations, um, and the poem keeps the soul separate from discord. It also keeps it separate from parks. It keeps all of these terms separate from one another, as though in their separateness, a sense of peace or a lack of strife could be somehow maintained, almost as though you analyzed or decomposed the world into its parts that do not interact, that do not generate friction or tension. Of course, as I said previously, the wind can never be separate from the parks. The wind is a meteorological phenomenon, and it will be present in parks on certain days. That's unavoidable. As a way to say that even though the park is a very formalized way of, let's say, forcing harmony upon us as we wander through it, the wind brings these discords into it. And therefore, on the surface of the earth, in the world, this strife cannot be avoided. And the soul is drawn into it as it tries to remain beyond it. The speaker alludes or suggests as much, although it says the soul flies beyond the parks and far beyond the discords of the wind, it never exceeds them, it never leaves the world. It remains in the world in the same way that it's always associated, unavoidably, invariably, with the death that releases it. Now, an interesting thing about this poem as a whole is that although it's strongly suggestive of classical allusions to myth, um, it is not so terribly direct in its allusions. I think it's clear enough that when we talk about swans and geese, that or the speaker has in mind the famous fable of the goose and the swan. Elsewhere in the poem, aside from this word Pythian, I can't really say that the allusions are explicit. Now, in some of the commentary that I read about this poem, I didn't try to read too much of it. It claimed that Stevens was focusing on swans as a hackneyed allusion, as a cliche, and as a cliche, perhaps something that should be avoided in verse. And this may well be true. It certainly makes the title easier to interpret and understand. But I would also say that if you were to use swans at all in literature or poems, it would be difficult to get away from the illusions that we commonly associate with swans. I mean, much in the same way as you really can't talk about the soul unless you also refer to death. As much as we would like to sweep the field clean of the detritus and the dead accumulation of associations, and to purify the matter, to see things, as Stephen said, as they are, that is probably a futile pursuit. Now, just because an allusion to myth or fable is suggested by a poem, it doesn't mean that the poem is actually alluding to anything at all. But in some cases, I find the suggestion so tantalizing that I really can't let it go. And so I want to look at this word discord, and I want to argue that Stevens is strongly suggesting the goddess Discordia. Now, Discordia, or Eris, depending whether you're talking about Roman or the original Greek, is the goddess or the personification of strife, of discord. Now, in these first two lines, there is no particular place. There are parks, which are places, but there is no specificity about a time or a place or an event. As I mentioned, our minds will take the wind and eventually unite it with parks, because you can't keep them separate. In other words, we will create an event in a particular place. And Discordia really is a personification with a particular place and mythological event. And that event is ultimately, the triggering of the Trojan War. Now, in the same way that Discordia, Eris, was not invited to Mount Olympus to participate in the wedding between Peleus and Thetis, they became parents of Achilles. In the poem, discord is kept separate from the park, which, although a far cry from Mount Olympus, is alike in being something that we would strongly associate with harmony. Now, in case you are unfamiliar with the tale, Discordia threw, as I wrote here, a golden apple with the note for the most beautiful among the wedding participants on Olympus. And this apple was claimed by three goddesses, Hera, Athena, and Aphrodite. The task of deciding who would get the apple, in other words, who was the most beautiful, fell to Paris. Paris was promised by Aphrodite, the most beautiful woman in the world, Helen. But by choosing her, he incurred the wrath of the other goddesses. You could say their vanity was wounded by his act, and strife was created. So, in this way, Discordia functioned as a perfect classical rhetorician, a practitioner of invective, and insulted someone so much that they created strife, as invective, as I said, always will. Now, I found that too tantalizing to let go. It probably could have been omitted, but I'm also going to tie this allusion into the later part of the poem. So I kind of felt that I had to make mention. I was going to make mention of it eventually, anyhow. The first two lines lack specificity. They seem to be involved in generalizations, but of course, we cannot go on long living in the world without coming to place in time and becoming involved in event. Uh, I'm only going to have time in this video to talk about uh, a particular event of some specificity revealing itself. A bronze rain from the sun descending marks the death of summer, which that time endures like one who scrawls a listless testament of golden quirks and Paphian caricatures. I want to stop there. One noticed that the style is getting really overly complicated. Perhaps the rhetorician could himself become targeted by other rhetoricians for being overly complex, labyrinthine, Byzantine in his constructions, all those great words. Now, what does that mean? A bronze rain from the sun descending. Well, a bronze rain is very specific. A bronze rain from the sun descending suggests a sun shower. If the sun is directly overhead, it may even appear that rain is pouring out of the sun. But this is a meteorological effect. For example, when we add the wind in, if we have clouds in one part of the sky and it's raining, the wind can push the rain and give the appearance that the water, the precipitation, is coming directly from the sun. But that's only an appearance. Now, a sun shower is contingent upon other effects in the atmosphere, such as the presence of rain clouds. Obviously, the absence of clouds and the sun in a sunny sky, aside from those clouds, and the presence of wind that could move the rain from one part of the sky into another. In addition, since the sun is descending, this is going to be a transient effect. One, not only because at some point the rain will stop, but because the sun is changing its position in the sky and it might pass behind a cloud. And with the sun disappearing, you would merely be left with rain. So here, as I wrote, a bronze rain from the sun descending, is a specific event that's contingent upon other chance events. Largely because of this, it's entirely transient. Now, while the speaker doesn't say where this event is taking place, it is an event, so it must be taking place somewhere. And we see that this event has a significance. It has a function. It marks the death of summer. Now, this gives me a little bit of pause. First of all, recall that we've been talking about the soul, and we said unavoidably in the context of death, confronting our own mortality, and then we're rather perhaps flip in referring to the end of summer as the death of summer. I mean, it's completely fine to speak of things figuratively. But we are, or we have been dealing with death as death, a very, very serious, if not the most serious topic of any contemplation. And now we've simply moved on to referring to death or using death in a very figurative way. But we'll put that matter aside for the time being. What's interesting is that the end of summer, well, will certainly end for all the parks everywhere, not just one particular park where something might be happening. It's a seasonal change. It'll affect all the parks. But of course, the event that marks the death of summer is particular to a place because it's particular to a set of circumstances, which I would argue would be a particular wind in a particular place, a particular event marking um, a reality that is true for both that place as well as for all other places like it. And I think that's a good place to end this particular video. I'll probably make several more. I'll need to at the rate that I'm going to reach the end of the poem and hopefully reach some sort of conclusion if possible. Thanks. Bye bye.